The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom is a fresh new twist on the classic Zelda formula. For the first time in the series, you play as Zelda. No, that game doesn't count. And Zelda can summon echoes of objects and monsters she's encountered to aid her in her adventure. As someone who's incredibly fond of the 2D Zelda games like A Link to the Past, I was incredibly excited by what was presented as an adventure where the only limitations are the echoes at your disposal and your creativity. But therein lies one crucial question. A question which people have joked about and pondered, but not yet put to the test. That is, until today. I tried to beat Echoes of Wisdom with only furniture, to answer a simple question. Whether I could live out my dream of having Zelda knock Ganon out with the equivalent of a steel folding chair. That's how the challenge started, but it quickly dawned on me just how inflexible a restriction furniture is. So the main rule of the challenge I'll be using is that I'm restricted to only objects. This means some of the echoes I'll be using may bend the definition of furniture just a little bit, but monster echoes are out of the question. In addition, I'll be ignoring any echoes that either have no defensible argument of being furniture, or that I don't absolutely need to clear the challenge. The restriction of objects already limits my access to echoes to about a quarter of all of them in the game, so with this consideration as well, I'll have to get creative. There are a few other rules to mention, but we'll address those when the time is right, as they come up throughout the challenge. And on the off chance it needs clarifying, this video will show off the entire game, so consider this your spoiler warning. If you're still playing through Echoes of Wisdom yourself, you can add this video to your watch later list, if people actually use that. Otherwise, I've included timestamps in the description for each part, so you can know whereabouts to stop in case you're avoiding spoilers. Starting things off in the tutorial sequence, we play as Link. Unfortunately, there's absolutely no way around this, but I waste no time fighting off Ganon at the end of Suthorn Ruins and rescuing Zelda. Once our daring escape is completed, we return to Hyrule Castle, where the king and his two advisors, General Right and Minister Left, are engulfed by a rift. Our allies are replaced with imposters, and we're accused of being responsible for creating the rifts, before being locked away in the basement of Hyrule Castle. Here our challenge can truly begin. We meet Tri, who gives us the Tri-Rod, and with this we learn our first echo, the table. This isn't exactly the premier furniture item we'll be using throughout the challenge, but for now I use the table echo to escape my cell and progress through the basement. Here we find a number of significantly more useful echoes, namely the wooden box, the Hyrule Castle pot, the decorative shrub, and the old bed. All of these except maybe the pot will be important tools in our toolkit, but perhaps none more vital than the old bed. The old bed can be used to cross horizontal distance, scale walls, and provide a wide surface for other objects. Needless to say, all of these will be integral to moving around the game and solving puzzles. I also find a boulder, which I could create an echo of, but I choose not to. I won't have any real need for it, and I can't think of anyone I've met who's used a boulder as part of their interior design. But we're not done discussing echoes yet. After I escape the castle and wash up on the beach, we encounter our first monsters, Zols. These guys are pretty harmless, and I dispatch them by throwing objects at them. Settle in, because this is how most combat in this challenge will be handled, at least for the early sections. This area is where the value of beds really come into play. They float on water, can be used to create platforms that cover a wide distance, and I'm able to create a staircase of beds to reach a piece of heart. I also find a second one in the caves after clearing out some boxes. While I won't be able to access every piece of heart in the game, with many locked behind echoes I won't be able to use, I'll be grabbing as many as I can to give myself an easier time in combat. Southern Village may just be a sleepy little village on the southern shores of Hyrule, but it's the home of Hyrule's savior. What's that? Link? No, I didn't mean Link, I mean the trampoline. This is another standout echo, as the trampoline makes it easier to reach heights that would otherwise need enough space to place crates or beds. The trampoline makes it easier than ever to climb treetops, cliff ledges, and so much more, and I'll be relying on it a lot throughout the game. I also managed to buy a third piece of heart from the store while I'm here. Out in the field east of the village, I use trampolines to completely bypass the normal path, jumping down to grab a few chests and enter a nearby cave. This cave has a piece of heart, but reaching it requires learning the Caramadillo echo. At least, that's the intended solution. I place a shrub with two trampolines on top and leap from the ladder, which allows me to reach the piece of heart without using any other echoes, successfully completing my first heart container. Back on the overworld, I clear out a camp of moblins with reasonable difficulty to get some refreshing grapes. These will be used in the future to create smoothies, drinks which can restore HP and grant various bonus effects. Afterwards, I climb down a nearby cliff towards a cave, with two braziers outside. Here I can learn the brazier echo, which will be crucial throughout the game as not only a source of fire and light, but damage. More on that later, but for now I backtrack to one last cave I skipped over, and use the brazier to open the way. Inside is a bottle which can hold a fairy, which while not essential, is definitely nice to have. That's the last thing I want to pick up for now, so I head to the nearby rift. Here we have our introduction to the Still World. These are hostile environments home to monsters, dungeons, and captive tries. We'll be spending a lot of time in the Still World, and while these rifts are usually fraught with enemies, I'm only forced to fight them if killing all of the nearby enemies is necessary to proceed. More often than not, I'll be running straight past them. Inside this rift, we find Minister Left. Though she's currently petrified within the rift, she'll be free if we can close it. And ahead lies Suthorn Ruins, the first dungeon of the game. Though it quickly seems like we can't progress, it's here that we receive the Bind ability. We can send Tri out to attach to a target and move it in line with Zelda. This is similar to Magnesis or Ultra Hand from the open world games, but the variety of applications this ability has will be invaluable to us. I progress through the tunnels, using objects to climb up instead of the Strangler, and run past the enemies ahead into another tunnel. I use the brazier to burn the nearby crates, igniting the unlit brazier and unlocking the door. And dashing past some enemies, we arrive in the room where we previously fought Ganon to find Link. Except this isn't the real Link, it's an imposter, and our first mini-boss. My method for this fight was not the most effective, but put simply, I ran away from Link and threw objects at him from height. So long as I had some height advantage, any objects I throw would hit Link instead of his shield. And by running out of Link's line of sight and landing a blow, I'm able to stagger him and deal several hits in a row, finishing the fight without too much trouble. With Echo Link defeated, we recover Link's sword, the Sword of Might. With this, we unlock Sword Fighter form, a special form which allows Zelda to swing a weapon and use other items typically reserved for the hero's arsenal. So now that we've unlocked Sword Fighter form, let's discuss how this will affect the challenge. Unfortunately, we can't completely prohibit Sword Fighter form. Some barriers like this one can only be destroyed by the Sword of Might. So with that in mind, I'll only be allowing the use of Sword Fighter form when absolutely necessary, and only to clear barriers and obstacles I have no other means of clearing. No combat, no jumping. And rest assured, I'll be highlighting any instance where I have no choice but to use Sword Fighter form. In the tunnels below, I also find my first accessory, the Heart Pin. Accessories give passive effects, such as increasing the appearance of heart drops, but particular accessories will be especially relevant later on. I hurry through the next couple rooms until I reach a combat room. There are 3 Deku Baba here, which I can kill by grabbing their heads with Bind and pulling them. Fortunately, I don't need to use Sword Fighter form here either, as Bind travels through the purple walls. I grab a small key in the next room and backtrack to the opposite pathway. After maneuvering through a tunnel with Bind and solving another simple puzzle, I find the boss key. I hurry back to the main corridor and unlock the door to the boss's lair. Introducing the first boss of the challenge, the Seismic Talus. Thankfully, the solution here is quite simple. Grab the core with Bind and deal damage while it's exposed. The challenge, however, is the dealing damage part. Summoning and throwing an echo to deal damage is time consuming, so I can only manage about 6 weak hits with every opening. After I deal enough damage, the Seismic Talus enters phase 2, where it attacks more quickly and guards its core in the head, giving me fewer openings to bind it. But eventually, I'm able to take it down after about 5 minutes, most of which was spent throwing pots and crates at the core. With Tri's friends released from captivity, the rift is restored, and Tri gains a triangle. This lets him summon echoes up to a cost of 4 instead of 3, meaning we can summon 4 beds. We also grab a heart container, before Minister Left escorts us to Lubri's house back in the overworld. Here Tri informs us of 2 more rifts, one in the Gerudo Desert and another in the Jabul Waters. We have the choice of tackling these rifts in either order, but fixing both will be our next objective. I leave Lubri's house and head north into Southern Prairie. Here I grab a heart piece atop the pillar with the ever-reliable staircase of beds, and while I plan to head west and tackle the Gerudo Rift, I first head north into Hyrule Field. My destination is a cave to the east of Kakariko Village. Though it's a bit of a detour, it's inside this cave that we find one of the most important echoes we'll be using throughout the entire challenge, the Spiked Roller. Okay, let me explain. Yes, you're right. Despite any argument I could make that this would be great as a cat-scratching post or a curtain rail, strictly speaking, this is not furniture. However, the spiked roller is crucial, as it's the only object in the entire game that does damage by itself. It doesn't need to be picked up or thrown, and it works in a number of different circumstances. While it might seem like this echo isn't necessary compared to the current means of damage at my disposal, with crates, pots, and braziers, the spiked roller will quickly prove to be essential to the success of this challenge. That's all I grab in this cave. While there is a piece of heart here as well, it's completely inaccessible to me. So I make a quick visit to Kakariko Village and pick up a fairy bottle by returning cuckoos to their pen, and clear 2 training sessions in the Slumber Dojo with my newly acquired Spiked Roller Echo. And on the way back to Gerudo Desert, I grab another piece of heart atop the pillar in the center of the lake west of Kakariko. Now that we finally arrived at Gerudo Desert, our first stop is the Oasis. Here we can find the first smoothie shop. I make a few drinks to stock up on healing items with the ingredients I've gathered. After that, I move on to Gerudo Town, where I unlock a waypoint and find a piece of heart in a cave on the north side of town. With those quick tasks taken care of, I travel to the southern desert, where the entrance to the large rift is. Here I defeat some rift monsters and meet Dona of the Gerudo. She explains that Gerudo Sanctum is sealed off to keep the monsters at bay, and suggests we visit their chief. Unfortunately, the chief and her advisor are skeptical about our power to mend the rifts, and so Dona suggests we investigate the 3 smaller rifts across the desert to prove that we're capable. Easy enough, right? The Southern Oasis Ruins rift is first, where dispatching a few monsters is all that's necessary. Second is the Southern Gerudo Desert rift, where 3 Gerudo soldiers are keeping post. They're dehydrated, but with the smoothies I made earlier, I'm able to get them back in fighting form. That leaves one final rift to investigate, the rift in the Ancestors' Cave of Rest to the north. And reluctantly, this is where we need to bring up a topic I've been loath to mention: exceptions. To clear this section of the main quest, we need to light the 2 braziers by the tomb beyond the rift. The problem is, the only passage lies through a tunnel blocked by sand. The only way to pass through this sand is with the Hole Mill, the mole-like monsters found in this cave. It's impossible to pass through the sand by any other means, and you can't jump over the rift in the entry room, nor carry echoes across it. Even if we were to use a power to summon echoes from afar, which we won't unlock until after mending one of the 2 large rifts, it's impossible to create an echo with the rift barring the way. So, put simply, it's impossible to light the braziers without passing through the tunnel, and it's impossible to pass through the tunnel without using the Hole Mill echo, making this the first exception necessary to continue. If it's any consolation, this is quite literally the only time we will use this echo. While the Hole Mill is used in other caves and side quests, none of these are necessary to beat the game, and much like Sword Fighter form, I'll be making it crystal clear when I'm forced to rely on any such exceptions. With our investigation of the 3 rifts completed, a new rift opens up in the desert, which is finally large enough to enter. This is our first encounter with a small rift, where the objective is to rescue some of Tri's friends from these murky-looking traps. We'll encounter these rifts both in the main quest and in the overworld later on in the game, but I won't be able to complete all of these. Thankfully, this rift is pretty straightforward. The first group is atop a pillar, the second is inside a tunnel accessible by moving these platforms around, and the final 3 are all dotted around places easily accessible with my echoes. With the rift mended, we expose the Gerudo advisor as an imposter and earn the chief's trust, allowing us to finally enter the Gerudo Sanctum. But to reach it, we have to traverse through a cave to release the seal. Inside this cave are a few things to note. The first is that this is where I discovered the value of the brazier in combat, with a technique I like to call brazier binding. Put simply, you place down a brazier, bind an enemy, and jump to lift them into the fire. While perhaps not the most ethical form of combat, it's particularly effective against certain enemies, like these Gibdos. In fact, this would have been my best solution for fighting Link back in Suthorn Ruins, but don't worry if you feel cheated out of that experience. Second, inside this cave is the Wind Cannon Echo. And while this isn't exempt from my rules given it's an object, it's another necessary echo. Deeper into the tunnels are 2 pathways blocked by sand, and it's impossible to jump over the sand or clear it by any other means. So while the wind cannon is an echo I'll be using infrequently, it's one I'm nevertheless forced to pick up. After passing a few more obstacles, I open the way to Gerudo Sanctum, allowing me to finally start dungeon number 2. The first few rooms of this dungeon have little of note. I use Bind to open hidden doors and pathways to find a small key, and I use it to open a room wherein I learn the snake statue echo. The puzzle of this dungeon is that there are 4 different animal statues, of which 2 are necessary to open the door to the boss. We're looking for an elephant statue and a hawk statue. But as this statue undoubtedly counts as furniture, I still add it to my collection. I dispose of some enemies in the next room and follow the path towards the door we're looking for, unlocking a waypoint for easy access later on. I tackle a few more combat rooms using the spiked roller before we reach the Gerudo Sanctum exterior. Though there are a few enemies dotted around, it's here we see one of the other uses of Bind, dropping enemies into the void. This is particularly effective given the fact that falling into the void doesn't deal damage in this game, so you can quite literally walk off the platforms with an enemy in tow to dispatch them. I follow the route around to the top of the sanctum where I'm able to re-enter from the opposite side. Here we find our second statue, the cat statue. Once again, not what we're looking for, but a fine addition to our collection. And in the next room, we face our second mini-boss. Link's back for a second time, and this time he's armed with a bow. Even though I have the spiked roller at my disposal, his arrows can destroy it quite easily. Throwing him to the pit doesn't help either, and as he's constantly creating distance, it's hard to throw pots or crates. So the best method for taking him out is, without a doubt, brazier binding. Once I deal enough damage, Link creates 2 extra copies of himself, ramping up the difficulty quite considerably. but I'm able to use the walls to lure the imposters close, giving me plenty of time to lift them into the fire of the brazier. Though it takes a few minutes, I take the imposters down and I receive the Bow of Might for my troubles. Unfortunately, this is once again where the game poses a puzzle solved only by sword fighter form. I use the bow to destroy one barrier, and in the room ahead, I use the statues I picked up previously to cross past the fire safely, where I find the elephant statue at long last, as well as a small key. One down, one to go. I travel back to the exterior and head east, following the path to a tower where I find the hawk statue awaiting me at its peak. With this, I can finally access the boss chamber, so I walk back to the nearby waypoint and open the doors using both statues. I grab the big key after a quick puzzle and head into the boss's lair downstairs. Our second boss fight is against Mogriff. It's a mole-griffin hybrid, I guess? Mogriff will burrow under the arena before charging towards you, but placing a statue in the way will cause it to stagger, giving me a window to deal damage with spiked rollers. And yes, while I could also deal damage with crates or pots, the spike roller lets me deal hits much more quickly. In phase 2, Mogriff takes to the skies and creates whirlwinds, before diving into the sand and charging once again. This doesn't change much for me, but with the addition of quicksand in the arena, I have to be careful where I stand, especially because standing too close to Mogriff when he's vulnerable can cause my echoes to be obstructed. Eventually I take the boss down, freeing another group of tries and increasing our companion's power even further. We can now create echoes at a distance, but unfortunately this doesn't extend across rifts or through walls. I also make sure to grab my 7th heart container before leaving. With that, we've wrapped up everything we needed to take care of in the Gerudo Desert, so next up is Jabul Waters. But on the way, I take care of a quick side quest to allow me to use a rental horse from Hyrule Ranch, and I grab a piece of heart in the grove. Afterwards, I arrive at Seaside Village, and it's here that we find out the rift has been causing trouble for Lord Jabu Jabu and the local Zora. I travel upriver to Lord Jabu Jabu's den to find the door sealed, and I encounter some River Zora who suggest we visit their chief. I waste no time hurrying to the River Zora village, where I pick up a new accessory from the shop. The Zora Flippers. This fashionable footwear increases my swim speed, and while it's not essential, it'll come in handy for the rest of this rift. I find the chief's hut and meet Drad, who insists that he can quell Lord Jabu Jabu's rage and prove himself the superior musician to Kashara of the Sea Zora. He departs for Crossflows Plaza, and after a quick visit to the Sea Zora, where, unsurprisingly, we have the exact same conversation with Kashara in reverse, I meet both chiefs at Crossflows Plaza. After your average teenage band practice, Lord Jabu Jabu appears and swallows the Zora chief's advisors in a fury. I follow Lord Jabu Jabu and the chiefs upstream to a small rift to find that Drad and a River Zora have fallen inside. Finally, we can do something other than run back and forth around Jabul Waters, but unfortunately this rift has some bad news for us. We've got 5 trapped tries to rescue, and the first 2 are easily found with a bit of platforming around the still world. The problem is, 2 of these tries are trapped in an underwater tunnel, blocked by brittlestone walls that can only be destroyed by explosives. While I can bind the nearby bombfish in place to destroy this wall and reach one of the tries, the other is trapped behind yet another bombable wall. Unfortunately, there are no other bombfish in this area, and reloading the area not only fails to respawn the bombfish, but causes the wolves we previously destroyed to return. So once again, we're forced to take an exception, this time by learning the bombfish echo. Of all of the exceptions I'll be forced to make in this challenge, this is the most significant. This won't be the last time we're forced to use bombs to progress, and while we'll eventually have access to bombs in sword fighter form, that would still be considered an exception. So ultimately, I'll be using bombfish to clear bombable walls when I have no other choice to progress, but they'll be off limits for combat or non-essential usage, like side quests or collecting pieces of heart. I find the last group of tries and mend the rift, saving both Drad and the trapped River Zora. Kashara calms his nerves with her harp before we travel back towards the sea in pursuit of Lord Jabu Jabu. Here we find out that Kashara and her Sea Zora boy have been trapped in a cave-in, and after a quick swim through an underwater passage and a simple bone puzzle, our rescue is complete. Drad plays his horn to give the scared child a burst of courage, and Drad and Kashara put aside their squabbles and vow to help each other out. With my new title of Hyrule's greatest marriage counselor attained, it's back to Lord Jabu Jabu's den. I repair the altar, and after the Zora Chief's duet, the way forward is opened at long last. However, we're not out of the Riptide just yet. Before we can tackle the 3rd dungeon, we have to fight the imposter Lord Jabu Jabu. And I'm just gonna say it now. This fight blows. I know I said that the arguments for the spiked roller would be popping up later on, and while the best arguments are still yet to come, this fight easily takes 2nd place. Let me paint a picture for you. Lord Jabu Jabu releases ocean debris and monsters into the arena, before swimming around in loop and then sucking up everything into his mouth. You have to swim away to avoid being swallowed while avoiding attacks from the monsters he releases. That all sounds doable enough, but then you have to consider that outside of the spiked roller, the only way of dealing damage to Lord Jabu Jabu is throwing objects at him. This poses 2 problems. First is that the arena is almost entirely water, meaning you have very little room to walk around or place objects, let alone pick them up and throw them. Especially when you consider that the only buoyant echoes we have are beds and crates, both of which can be destroyed by their small monsters with ease. The second problem is that Lord Jabul Jabul's hitbox is incredibly inconsistent. Using the window when he's releasing debris as an example, even if you're quick enough to place an echo to stand on, place one more for a foundation, and place one third and final object to pick up and throw at Lord Jabul Jabul, oftentimes you'll fail to deal damage unless you hit specific parts of his body. I couldn't quite figure out where the best weak spot was, but it seemed as though anything that hits his crown would be deflected. Now let's say, hypothetically, that you endure all of that, and you're able to deal enough sporadic single hits with crates and objects. Well, as the fight progresses, Lord Jabul Jabul will release more threatening enemies, including Octoroks, Biri, and Albatrols. The Octoroks and Albatrols in particular are so accurate that it makes it near impossible to find openings long enough to create 3 crates, pick one up and throw it at Lord Jabul Jabul, who remember is still swimming around the arena and swallowing debris, though now even more quickly than before. With the spiked roller, this fight is still messy, but you remove the problem of having to create several echoes just to do a single hit. I'm so confident about how miserable this fight is without the spiked roller. In fact, I'd go as far as saying it'd be impossible to beat Jabul Jabul using only crates in less than 20 minutes. And if anyone proves me wrong on that, I'll pin your comment and shout you out if I make another Echoes of Wisdom video in the future, because I would genuinely love to see it. Anyway, I eventually managed to take Lord Jabul Jabul down, meaning we can finally enter the third dungeon rift. Some of the platforming here can be a little tricky, given the tight spaces and the echoes I'm limited to. This rift is also where we encounter a new echo, the water block. And while this arguably falls into the category of object, I won't try and argue that water is furniture. Either way, I leave it behind. It would definitely be nice to have and open up some sequence breaks for me, but there's nothing I'll strictly need this echo for. Inside the dungeon itself, one of the interesting parts is actually right at the beginning. In the starting corridor, running forward will cause a trapdoor to open up, sending you into an underwater tunnel sequence. However, you can bypass this section of the dungeon entirely by placing beds down and climbing over it, allowing me to skip straight to the main hub room of the dungeon. We'll be backtracking to this room often, as we'll be exploring the dungeon for these coloured switches to add more water to this geyser, opening a path to the boss. I go down the path to the left first, through an underwater passage. Thankfully, all this requires is some evasive swimming, and after a simple torch puzzle, I find the second of 5 switches. Next up is the path to the right, another underwater passage, though this time there are some bombfish. Fortunately, there aren't any bombable walls in this area, though the ladder at the end of the passage leads to a large room with many different enemies. I use the spiked roller to clear the area before climbing up towards the door. This leads to a combat room with several sand crabs, though I'm able to take them down easily enough with brazier binding, granting access to the third switch. Back in the hub room, I'm now able to ride the geyser up to the next floor. This time I take the passage on the right first. I find a golden egg in the underwater passage, as well as a bombable wall. Thankfully, this one obstacle can be cleared without using echoes. There's a nearby bombfish which I'm able to carefully move towards the wall, clearing the path to the dungeon's big key. Even though some echoes are inevitable exceptions, I'll be finding opportunities to limit their use like this as often as possible. The rest of the passage is pretty straightforward. I emerge in a combat room which is dealt with by the spiked roller, and I press down the fourth switch with a statue. Though I spent more time than I care to admit seeing if I could somehow climb up to the boss lair without using the final switch, I was unsuccessful. Though ironically enough, if I'd picked up the water block, I reckon you could clear this dungeon in about 5 minutes. Nevertheless, I head left into the final passageway. I navigate the driftwood planks and hit the switches in the next room with a combination of echoes. After one final combat room against a group of Tektites, I managed to push the final switch. With the dungeon finished, it's time for arguably the most notable boss in the entire challenge. Meet Volcavor, the boss of Jabul Ruins, and the only boss whose fight occurs in a 2D passageway. Not only that, it's entirely underwater, meaning it's completely impossible to pick up and throw objects. Dropping objects on the weak spot on Volcavor's back does nothing either, but thankfully there's one echo in the entire game that is able to deal damage while also counting as an object. That's right, it's the spiked roller. Without this echo, an object-only challenge run of Echoes of Wisdom would be completely impossible. And so, if Jabul Jabul wasn't enough to convince you of this echo's value, Volcavor should easily be the tipping point. Thankfully, the biggest challenge this fight poses is knowing that this echo is required. Swimming above the boss to drop the spiked roller is pretty easy, and the roller does considerable damage. I'm able to take the third boss down in record time, bringing an end to the third dungeon. The rift is repaired and Try's power grows, allowing him to summon monster echoes for fewer triangles. This is completely and utterly pointless, but I don't want to put a damper on their spirits when I can see they're trying so hard. Anyway, I grab my 8th heart container and return to the overworld. The Zora prepare one final send-off with the real Lord Jabu Jabu this time, and we're reunited with General Wright. Our next destination is Hyrule Castle, to confront the imposters and rescue the King of Hyrule. And though the soldiers at the entrance don't believe that we're the real deal, they quickly change their tune when the castle town is engulfed by a rift. A quick jump down the nearby well, and we're straight back into the still world for our 4th dungeon. Stilled Hyrule Castle is a little shorter than the other dungeons we've encountered, though that's mainly because there's nothing stopping us from running straight past every enemy in the exterior. Once we're inside Hyrule Castle itself, we find the true king at long last, and open a passageway beneath the throne that leads back to the Hyrule Castle basement. This is like the escape sequence from the game's prologue, but in reverse. Getting caught by a guard will send you into an arena to fight off against monsters. Thankfully, this is a pretty minor setback, and I hurry back to the cells where we find that Impa has also been petrified in the still world. Tri insists that we read her diary, but I know better than to disrespect someone's privacy, so I carry onwards to basement floor 2. Here we have a combat encounter underground against a number of Darknuts, heavily armoured monsters who take no damage from the spiked roller. Fortunately, they are susceptible to brazier binding, though this is a little trickier to pull off in 2D compared to 3D. I eventually take them out and escape the tunnel. The next room presents a puzzle suitable for practicing summoning echoes at range, while the following room is traversed easily enough by throwing the nearby monsters into the void. I climb up a staircase of beds to find the door to the boss's lair, heading left to search for the key. After a combat room and an underwater maze in the next few rooms, I emerge in a room with more guards. I climb up to a pillar and press the button to make a chest with a small key appear. With this in hand, I backtrack to the room with the boss door and head right, dropping down to a locked door nearby. This brings me to yet another tunnel, which eventually opens up into a combat room with 2 Darknuts and a soldier using a ball and chain. Once again, the spiked roller is completely ineffective against armoured enemies, so I'm forced to slowly but surely brazier bind them one at a time. This takes a couple minutes, but fortunately I get through mostly unscathed. And not only do we receive the big key for our efforts, but one of the most valuable accessories in the entire game, the Frog Ring. The Frog Ring allows Zelda to jump higher, and the value of this cannot be understated. Currently our jump height is equal to a wooden table, which we'll call 1 unit high. Objects like crates and boulders are 2 units high. And now with the Frog Ring equipped, we can jump onto such objects with ease. This will make it much easier to move around and climb vertical heights with fewer echoes, and needless to say, I'll be having this accessory equipped for the rest of the game. So all that's left is the boss. And I know some of you are thinking that perhaps I've been relying on the spiked roller too much, especially after Jabul Waters. So to prove that I'm not completely reliant on it, I'll take down this next boss with nothing but crates and pots. It's not like it'll be anyone too tough, right? Meet Ganon. Or rather, Echo Ganon. This fight is much the same as when we fought Ganon as Link in the tutorial, but with a few extra attacks thrown in. Ganon can spin his lance to deflect attacks, and he'll periodically lunge. He's susceptible to attacks after this lunge, however. Long enough for at least 1 pot throw, but 2 if you're quick. Once you did enough damage, he'll add a new attack in phase 2, throwing his lance, which you can catch with bind and redirect into him. This creates a much longer opening for us to deal damage, long enough for about 3 to 4 hits with pots. His second new attack releases a series of fireballs, but the opening here is much shorter, and as Ganon is spinning his lance for the whole time, it can be hard to land a hit. So for phase 2, I focus on creating openings with the first attack and prioritize dodging the fireballs. After a few more hits, he roars again, signifying phase 3, and the introduction of an all too familiar attack. It's tennis time. At least it would be if we actually had any way of returning Ganon's fireballs. So instead, I dodge to the side of the fireball and use the opening to conjure pots to throw at him while he's idle. While not exactly the best display of sportsmanship, this is our only option for dealing damage in this phase, as this attack replaces the lance throw I'd been relying on earlier. After a few dozen pot throws, it's time for the final phase. Now Ganon will cycle between every attack in his arsenal, adding more projectiles and leaving shorter openings. Thankfully, this means he's doing his lance throw once again, which ends up making the fight a little quicker than it was in phase 3. And after a nice, easy 17 minutes, I strike Ganon down with his own weapon, bringing the fight to a close. With this victory, we're about halfway through the game. Tri gets their usual power boost, though all it does this time is reduce the cost of echoes that we're yet to find, and truthfully never will, though we also get an always welcome heart container. We go to leave until a mysterious creature crashes through the wall and lunges at us, but Link leaps to our defense with a club and strikes the enemy back. We extend a hand to have him leave with us, but at the last moment he's encased in crystal and pulled into the darkness. Though Link's whereabouts are unknown, it's not all bad news. The rift at Hyrule Castle is mended, and the King of Hyrule is safe and sound. And that's not all. We also get the opportunity to learn a fantastic new echo, Zelda's Bed. One feature of beds that I hadn't brought up until now is that you can rest in them to heal hearts. The old bed heals half a heart periodically, but Zelda's bed heals 2 hearts at once. After all, there's nothing like sleeping in your own bed. Unfortunately, we don't have too much time to rest. 3 new rifts have opened up across Hyrule, at Eldin Volcano, the Faron Wetlands, and Holy Mount Lanayru. These 3 locations connect to the 3 goddesses and the Prime Energy, a source of power left behind by the goddesses with untold potential. So our next task is clear. Visit the 3 sites, mend the rifts, and receive the goddesses' sanctions to seek out the Prime Energy. Much like when we were faced with the choice of going to the Gerudo Desert or Jabul Waters, we can tackle these rifts in any order, but my first destination will be Eldin Volcano, for a specific reason I'll go into more detail about later on. With that said, there are a few quick tasks we can take care of before our expedition. First things first, I head to Lake Hylia to visit the Great Fairy Shrine. For a small fee, the Great Fairy will allow us to equip more accessories, and given the fact that we just found the Frog Ring, an accessory I'll have equipped for the entirety of the game, it'd be nice to have an extra accessory slot. I can only afford 1 for now, but this will suffice for what I have in mind. Next I head for Eastern Palace. There's a side quest we can take care of here to investigate a mysterious disturbance inside. Eastern Palace is one of a few mini dungeons in this game, but this is the only one we'll be tackling. It doesn't take long until I find the boss of Eastern Palace, Smog, who can be defeated by damaging his main body and having his smaller smog clouds combine to make him vulnerable once more. After 3 phases, Smog goes down, leaving behind a piece of heart. But in addition, the researcher outside who gave us the side quest also grants a new accessory, the Ancient Charm, which reduces the damage we take, a nice passive bonus to have. Lastly, I backtracked to some areas I'd been to previously to pick up a couple pieces of heart, finding 2 in Jabul Waters, 1 near Hyrule Castle, 1 in Hyrule Field, and 1 last piece of heart from the acorn collecting minigame. I also mend a few smaller rifts to get Tri's level up. We'll be mending some small rifts in the story, and some of the future levels have some bonuses I'd like to get sooner rather than later. I mend 1 rift near the Gerudo Desert, and another at the sanctuary north of Hyrule Castle, without encountering too much trouble. So without much further ado, it's time to climb Eldin Volcano. And this is a good chance to say that if you're not already subscribed to the channel, I'd be really grateful if you'd consider doing so. These challenge runs playing through an entire game take a long time to make, especially when it's a new game like this one so soon after release. And if you've made it this far, I figure you're probably enjoying the video, right? Anyway, though the mountain climb is perilous, it's nothing that can't be overcome with a staircase or 2 of beds. I eventually arrive at the entrance to Goron City. We hear that there's a newly appointed chief of the Gorons, Darstan, but unfortunately he's fallen into a rift. So without wasting any time, I leap into action. There are 4 groups of Tri to rescue here, and thankfully 3 of the 4 groups pose a little issue. The problem comes with the 4th, which can be found at the bottom of a tunnel inside this Goron-shaped urn. This tunnel is filled with bombable walls, and once again I'm left with no alternative but to use the bombfish. 4 is enough to clear the path, and I rescue the 4th and final group of Tris. Though Darstan and the other Goron have been rescued from the rift, we still need to know how to access the large rift in the crater, and the 2 Goron elders who might know the way are still unaccounted for. So we're tasked with checking out 2 areas on the volcano to look for them, Rockroast Quarry and the Lizalfos Burrow. I head to Rockroast Quarry first, and all it takes to get the elder back in action is carrying some rockroast from the back of the quarry with bind. Next up is the Lizalfos Den, but on the way I pick up 2 more pieces of heart, one from atop the cliff overlooking the mountain, and another from a small island in a nearby pool of lava. Inside the Lizalfos Burrow we find the 2nd elder, but we can't convince them to leave without clearing the area of Lizalfos. Thankfully, this is taken care of easily enough with the spike roller and some effective use of bind. Back at Goron City, we finally get a clue pointing us towards a secret path to the crater, a tunnel at the back of the city. Darstan shows us a portrait of his dad, the previous Goron chief and the source of his inspiration. Unfortunately, the only way to the crater is behind this portrait, so we yank it off the wall. It's okay though, he's still got a stone tablet of advice and mottos given to him by his dad, so he's not fully without mementos. Lava pools are becoming more and more frequent the deeper into the volcano we go, and there is an echo that we can learn that would help us here, the lava rock. With that said, I'm also able to pass across the lava with statues we collected in Gerudo Sanctum, so I stick to those instead. Eventually, we arrive at a giant boulder barring the way, but Darstan is able to clear a path by lodging his tablet into a crack and splitting the boulder apart. Tri drops the weakest pun of the year, with a pause and everything, and at last we can finally enter the still world. I hurry through the exterior, clearing the path of enemies by dropping them into the void and platforming with beds and statues, until I arrive at the entrance to Dungeon 5, Eldin Temple. As you might have guessed, the theme of this dungeon is lava. and we'll need to get creative to navigate it with our limited echoes. Many rooms in Eldin Temple have these thermal vents in them, for which you typically use a flying echo to glide wherever you need to go. But a staircase of beds proves just as effective in most cases. Most of the early rooms are pretty straightforward. I solve the puzzles and run past any enemies I'm able to until I arrive in a tunnel. Here the height of the lava rises and falls, meaning I need to move quickly to avoid getting caught. I platform over to a switch to open a nearby door, which leads me to a chest with a small key. I backtrack to the previous room in the tunnel and emerge outside a locked door, and inside we find a room scattered with bombable blocks. But thankfully this isn't an obstacle, it's an arena, for our third and final fight against Echo Link. By now you can probably guess how this one goes, but let me give you a hint. It's very thematic to the dungeon. After a few minutes and many third-degree burns, Link goes down, leaving behind the Bombs of Might. At last, we have an alternative to the Bombfish, but it doesn't help us much given Sword Fighter form is still considered to be one of our exceptions, and we needed to clear Jabul Waters to access the volcano. Nevertheless, the tunnel beyond the miniboss room is one of our final instances of using Sword Fighter form. I clear a purple barrier and then I'm forced to use several bombs to uncover a small key, which I use on the nearby door to uncover a tunnel filled with lava. At the bottom lies the big chest, but as soon as I obtain the key, the lava begins to rise. Thankfully, I'm an expert at moving quickly and creating staircases by this point, so I manage to escape without any trouble. Back in the tunnel, I'm forced to bomb another wall to create a path back above ground, which leads to a combat encounter with a fire wizrobe. Though these enemies can be tricky to pin down, I'm able to damage them by jumping and summoning a spiked roller, though to call the fight quick would be a lie. I backtrack to the tunnel, and though it looks like I might need to use yet another bomb to clear a path to the door, I'm able to maneuver through a tight passageway by placing trampolines below me. One final room lies between me and the boss, and though you're clearly intended to fly across this pool of lava, I have no such luxury available to me. I carefully create a path through the lava with statues, doing my best to stick to the edges where I can remain out of sight of most nearby enemies. Safely crossing the pool of lava, I top up my health before heading inside the boss's lair. This boss may look familiar to some. It's Volvagia. Thankfully, the method for dealing with this boss is also familiar. Volvagia will create powerful fireballs from the green necklace around its neck, but if you bind the necklace and pull it off, Volvagia will be vulnerable. I use every opening as an opportunity to hurl spiked rollers at the dragon, and that's about all the fight takes. After each cycle, Volvagia will fly to a new spot in the arena, and it can be a little tricky to damage Volvagia when they're in the spot in the bottom right, as they sit inside a pool of lava. But for the most part, this fight is simple enough. If only I could say that about the next two bosses we'll have to face down the line. I take Volvagia down and claim the usual spoils, a heart container and a once again useless level up for Tri. In addition, we receive Din's Sanction, the first of 3 blessings from the goddesses that we'll need to reach the Prime Energy. Returning to the surface, we receive a hero's welcome back from the Gorons. Darstan has finally found his confidence as chief, and all is well on Eldin Volcano. But we have one final task to take care of while we're here, a side quest. Inside Goron City is Barsa, a fireworks artist. He's keen to celebrate Darstan's appointment as the new chief, but he's missing some blast powder soil for his fireworks. Thankfully, it takes the better part of 20 seconds to collect this and return to Barsa, and for our trouble, if you can even call it that, we receive the Firework Echo. This echo is exactly the reason I chose to tackle Eldin Temple first. And believe it or not, this echo will be crucial, no, maybe even essential, for 3 specific tasks between now and the end of the game. And these uses are so out there that I'd be surprised if anyone can guess all 3. Feel free to try. If you're at this point of the video knowing what's to come and you're up for the challenge, leave a comment with what you think those 3 specific uses are. I'd love to see how closely people's guesses align with the truth. Anyway, with that taken care of, it's time we turn our sights towards the next rift. I'll be heading towards the Faron Wetlands. I warp to Lake Hylia and climb up the western cliffs to take my first steps into this new region. The Faron Wetlands is arguably just as treacherous as Eldin Volcano. Many of the enemies in the area wield electricity and projectiles, making it a perilous journey from here to our destination of Scrubton. Scrubton is the home of the Deku Scrubs, where the large rift has opened up, so for now I waste no time in hurrying towards the rift. Sadly, gaining entry won't be so straightforward. The Deku Scrubs are trendy creatures, and the latest trend to sweep over Scrubton is spiderweb cotton candy, which can only be collected near the rift. This trend is so prolific in fact, that the area beside the rift has been dubbed the sweet spot, and cordoned off to anyone who doesn't have a membership card. While I'm here, I refresh my supply of smoothies. Get it? Refresh? Because they're refreshing smoothies, right? I buy some more smoothies before heading south towards a small rift. But on the way, I take the time to head inside a nearby cave, as although it's dimly lit, I'm able to spot an easily accessible piece of heart. Back outside, I arrive at a small rift in the southeastern corner to find a group of scrubs. The Deku scrub Blossu is being told how lucky he is, that he's got access to spiderweb cotton candy right by his house. Though Blossu insists that this is a problem, because the rift has engulfed his entire house. I guess Blossu is a smoothie glass half empty kind of scrub, but as he's got a membership card, mending the rift and restoring his house is in our best interests. So I jump into the rift. Here we have 5 groups of Tri to recover, and for the most part this is pretty straightforward. Many of these Tri are hidden inside enemies or behind cobwebs, meaning there's liberal usage of the Brazier Echo to recover these Tri. This works for 4 of the 5 groups, but the last one hidden away in the tunnel isn't so easy. I'm able to use the nearby Scrantula to create a path up, but it's impossible to get past without using bombs. But if it's any consolation, this is the last time we'll have to endure this exception. I snag the final Tri and return to the overworld. While Blossu is pretty pleased with our efforts, the other Deku scrubs are less than thrilled. We're thrown into prison for removing the source of the cotton candy, and all of our possessions are taken away. Though thankfully, breaking out of our cell is simple enough, at least compared to the prison itself. This sequence is similar to our Hyrule Castle escape way back at the beginning of the game, only this time we have no echoes to work with. Thankfully, we can still use Bind, and the Deku scrubs aren't quite observant enough to question why a crate is moving by itself. I make it to the basement floor where a nearby puzzle holds a piece of heart. While I could easily return later with the Tri-Rod and trivialize this puzzle, there's no fun in that, so I spend a couple minutes creating a path up to claim my prize, completing our 13th heart container. I solve another bind puzzle to clear our route to the next room, where we find a Deku scrub using the Tri-Rod as a cotton candy cane. Thankfully, he returns our belongings with little to no resistance, so we can continue our daring escape. I hurry down the other staircase to find a group of Deku scrubs talking about how fearful they are of monsters, which is a clear hint that I should use trampolines. I jump down a well in the next room and navigate through the waterways. Fortunately, Blossu is waiting for us on the outside, and is happy to hand over the membership card as thanks to bringing his house back. With membership secured, I hurry to the sweet spot, just in time to watch the rift expand and engulf a group of Deku scrubs. Finally realizing the danger the rift poses, the Deku scrubs give us permission to mend the rift, so I jump into the stilled Faron Wetlands. There are a few things that make this area problematic. First, at the end of the first area is a group of several torches, which need to be extinguished simultaneously. This would be made simple if we had an echo for the Drippy Tune, the frog monster found in the Faron Wetlands which creates rain. But to the surprise of nobody, that isn't an option. Thankfully, this doesn't call for another exception. There's a Drippy Tune here in the Stilled World, so I bind it with Tri and escort it to the torches, extinguishing them without any trouble. Though for the curious, you could also extinguish these with the Wind Cannon Echo. But unfortunately, this isn't the only obstacle in our way, and the next one is a much bigger concern. We emerge out of the tunnel to find a locked room with 2 buzz blobs and 3 green crystals, which light up when exposed to electricity. Light up the 3 crystals to unlock the door. An easy puzzle, right? The problem is, one of these crystals is completely blocked off by a fence, which we can only bypass by summoning an echo at range. Some of you might be wondering if we could skip this puzzle entirely, by scaling the cliff wall instead of entering the cave, but that isn't possible either. Not only would a wall this tall need a crawlula to climb up, but even if we had that, there's an invisible wall that makes this impossible. So regrettably, we have no choice but to accept our 3rd exception of the challenge. Ahead of us lies Faron Temple, but if we were to go through the front entrance, we'd find ourselves unable to proceed. So instead I jump to the ledge lower down the cliff and enter the temple from an entrance behind a cobweb. Inside this first room we have a new puzzle, 2 matching tiles which have to be pressed down at the same time. This can be challenging with our limited echoes, but thankfully I'm able to grab the nearby statue at the edge of my bind range and drop it on the tile at the same time as I land from a jump. Next is a combat encounter with an electric Wizrobe. Unlike the last Wizrobe I fought, this one is vulnerable to brazier binding, so I take it down without trouble. I light all of the torches in the next room and pass through an underwater tunnel, before reaching a room with more green crystals. I defeat all of the enemies and activate the green crystals to open a path to the next room. Here we have another tile puzzle, only this time we have these scales to work with. I use a bed echo and some extra weight to have the bed lower onto the tile as soon as I jump onto mine, opening the path to the boss's lair. As quick as this is, we still have to find the big key, and we're a little ways off from that. I follow the path further west to find a chest with a small key, and navigate through the dark maze to find a waypoint, as well as a path back to the central room. I press the nearby switch to lower the fence, before heading upstairs to the locked door. Inside, we have our first mini-boss, who I couldn't find an official name for, so I'll call it the Duo Barber. I do not like the Duo Barber. Thankfully, this fight isn't too complicated. Its weak spot is along each head stalk, but the spike roller does a great job of landing multiple hits. I land the final blow, only for the game to softlock. I couldn't tell you what caused this, but thankfully Echoes of Wisdom has frequent autosaves, so I'm able to reload my game to take the Duo Barbar down for a second time. Good thing I won't have to fight it more than twice, right? I back out to the mini-boss room and head back outside. I climb the outskirts of Faron Temple and uncover a hidden entrance behind a statue. Inside is another puzzle with green crystals, so I'm forced to use 2 more buzz blobs to reveal a chest with a small key inside. Though thankfully, this is the last time we'll need to use this echo. With a small key in hand, I backtrack to the first entrance we used and head up the nearby ladder. After solving a simple weight puzzle, I clear the path to the locked door and descend the ladder to find yet another mini-boss room. Duo Barbar is back. And to make matters worse, it has 4 heads this time instead of 2, making my naming completely inaccurate. Moreover, the extra 2 heads aren't just for show. Not only are they immune to fire, but they also don't take damage from the spiked roller, meaning I'm forced to target their weak spot. In addition, drippy tunes will spawn around the arena, making the electric projectiles fired by the Quadra Barbar much more threatening. The fight is the opposite of quick and glamorous, but eventually I manage to take down the 4 heads, felling the monster for good and revealing the big key. As I'd already found the boss lair, I waste no time teleporting to the waypoint and unlocking the door. And inside, we find yet another familiar face, albeit easily one of the most annoying bosses we'll face in this challenge, Gohma. Gohma is a boss that will need little introduction to most Zelda fans, but for the uninitiated, here's the deal. Gohma will stay attached to the wall, but periodically the eye on its back will open. Typically, this would be your opportunity to shoot an arrow, making Gohma collapse to the ground and vulnerable to attack. The problem is, our bow is off limits. Thankfully, we have another option. Gohma has 3 familiar looking green crystals on its legs, and if we were to activate each with a zap of electricity, we could knock it down and create a similar opening. But I said that we'd already used the buzz blob for the last time, and I do mean it. We won't be relying on this method either. So what's left? Well, when I said we needed to shoot an arrow at Gohma's eye, that wasn't entirely true. All we need to do is deal damage, and one such way of doing that would be to make a staircase up towards Gohma's eye and throw a spiked roller. But the window after Gohma's laser attack is pretty short, and missing means waiting another whole cycle of attacks for another opportunity. But there's one other way that we can damage Gohma: the firework. By placing the firework echo on the ground below Gohma's eye, I can stagger it and create an opening to deal damage with spiked rollers. Believe it or not, I didn't even know this interaction existed going into this fight. I had the firework echo in mind for 2 other uses, but fireworks are easily the most effective method I have at my disposal for dealing with Gohma. As Gohma enters phase 2, they spend more time attacking from the ground, charging at me and swiping with its claws. There's pretty much nothing I can do to touch Gohma during these attacks, but after a short while it climbs back onto the wall and continues its previous pattern of attacks. After almost 15 minutes, I'm eventually able to knock Gohma down for the final time and deal the killing blow, ending what is no doubt the trickiest and most tedious boss fight we've had so far. The goddess Farol grants us her sanction and tells us the true identity of our foe, a creature called Null, who existed in an endless void consuming all life indiscriminately. The goddesses created the earth and sky to contain Null, but Null created the rifts to try and bring the world back to its previous state, locked in a bitter struggle. Armed with our second sanction, new knowledge, and an extra heart container, we return to Scrubton, only to find that smoothies have become the new fad. But we don't have time to stick around. It's time for us to head to the final rift on Holy Mount Lanayru. To reach the rift, we first have to climb Hebra Mountain, accessible via a mountain passage north of the sanctuary. But there's just one problem with this. The entrance is blocked by a bombable wall. While I could just use the bombfish or bombs of might yet again, I did say that I would only use them if absolutely necessary. And that isn't the case this time. I grabbed my rental horse and parked it at the base of Eldin Volcano, before teleporting to the peak. Here I find some of the enemies that were giving me grief earlier, the Zeros. These flying monsters spit bombs, and by now, you're probably figuring out what my plan is. I bind one and jump down the mountain, hopping on my horse and riding all the way to the mountain passage at the base of Hebra Mountain. And once I'm there, well, I'll let the clip speak for itself. Speedrunners, this one's for you. Oh. There's no way that worked. While I don't think any actual speedrunner would bring a monster such a far distance just to fly up Hebra Mountain, this interaction was as helpful as it was unexpected, which is to say, very. But now we can start our hike up Hebra Mountain. A short ways in, we find a Yeti asleep in the snow. This is Conde, Hebra Mountain's one and only resident. And not only does he help us navigate the mountain safely, but he offers us shelter in his home while we wait for the blizzard to pass. We spend some time learning about Conde, his big brother, and his dad, before the storm eventually settles down and Conde clears a route into the mountain for us. Inside this cave, we have a few new echoes, ice blocks and snowballs. While both of these pass as objects, I won't have any essential use for either one, so I ignore them for now. I navigate the puzzles inside the cave until I find Conde once more, shoveling snow into the rift in an effort to clean it up. It's endearing if nothing else, but he doesn't seem to understand that his efforts are in vain. So we enter the rift to make his life a little easier. And finally, I feel as though I can talk about a rift without bringing up an exception. All that's required from this one is a bit of platforming and liberal use of fire. So I'm able to rescue all 5 groups of Tri without much trouble. Back on the overworld, we continue our ascent of the mountain, returning to the outside once more. I grab a piece of heart by the nearby lake and hurry onwards into another cave. Here we have several air vents and wind cannons, but I use statues to block them and pass by safely. The next few rooms are combat encounters, against ice keys as well as a new enemy, Freezards, who chase you with frost breath. I dispatch these enemies without too much trouble and emerge outside once again, after solving a few more puzzles. After dashing up the last stretch of the mountain, we find Conde once again, with who he believes to be his big brother. The creature jumps away, and chasing the pair further up the mountain, it seems as though the creature attacked Conde, making him doubt whether he's been good enough for his brother to come home from his travels. Honestly, you can't help but feel a little bad for the big guy, so I leave him a brazier to keep him warm and put on some firework displays for him to enjoy. Anyway, it's time for the next rift. Still, Gerudo Mountain is a unique one, because we're actually climbing from one mountaintop to another. This is also where we would find one of the most useful echoes in the game, the Cloud Echo. Clouds are unique in that they're platforms that don't need to be supported by a foundation, meaning you can platform endlessly if you so wish. But unfortunately, clouds are not furniture, as much as Animal Crossing would want me to believe otherwise. And while it would certainly be nice to have this echo, it's not essential for anything, so reluctantly I have to leave it behind. I carefully navigate past monsters, chasms, and a charming mural left by Conde's brother until I arrive at the entrance to Lanayru Temple. This temple has a unique gimmick to it. Scattered throughout are these pedestals with fiery orbs. Transporting an orb to a pedestal with a circuit will activate the connected fan, filling a room with hot air and melting anything frozen nearby. I follow the tunnel through to another room filled with ice and a small key visible beneath the surface. In the next room, I activate another fiery pedestal, melting the ice and giving me access to the key, before returning to the pedestal and reactivating it with an ice orb. This causes the ice to freeze once more, making it easier to access the path on the right. We'll be using both of these different orbs to manipulate the temperature in various different rooms. I use the icicles in the next tunnel to protect myself from the icy vents, and do some good old-fashioned platforming with crates and beds to progress to the next room. After another quick pedestal puzzle, I reach a room with the same tiles we saw in Faron Temple. This time we have to push the ice block and press the nearby button down at the same time, and though it takes me a few attempts to nail the timing, I manage to get it down before running out of ice blocks, earning a small key for my troubles. The next combat room is odd. I can't progress until I defeat the several Temper Tweelers throughout the room, but I can't actually damage them with fire nor with the spiked roller. Fortunately, they do take damage from the icy vents, so I drag them all next to a vent and simply wait for them to die. Yeah, that's it. Eventually they'll go down and I'm able to proceed with the dungeon map in hand. Unfortunately, the next room is the mini-boss, and one that will prove to be just as problematic as the previous room. Here we face a giant green blob, which is immune to every form of attack at my disposal. The spiked roller, brazier, even the firework are all completely ineffective. The only way to damage the blob is by freezing it, after which it becomes susceptible to regular attacks. And put simply, there's no way around this, meaning this is where we need to discuss the fourth and final exception. Back during my ascent of Gerudo Mountain, I mentioned the Freezards I encountered. What I didn't mention is that I learnt this echo, as it's the last one we'll need to allow to beat the game. This mini-boss is the first obstacle we'll need to overcome, and I'll be using the Freezard for the sole purpose of freezing targets. I opted for this echo over any other echoes that can freeze because the Freezard doesn't deal extra damage, unlike a Wizrobe or an Octorok. Even though I'm armed with the Freezard, this is no easy fight. As the blob takes damage, it splits into multiple smaller blobs, all of which will fire boiling water at both me and any frozen blobs I'm trying to damage. The fight is a long, arduous process of freezing blobs, keeping other blobs out of the nearby spring so that they can't thaw my target out, and chipping away at whatever blobs I can while ensuring I'm not overwhelmed. This is easily my least favourite fight in the entire game, and outside of rocking up armed to the teeth with an ice Wizrobe, I can't see a way to make this fight any less annoying. Thankfully, this mini-boss is followed by one of the more interesting puzzle rooms in the challenge. In this tunnel are 4 unlit braziers, which must be ignited to open the path forward. 3 of these are handled easily enough, either by summoning brazier echoes from distance, or melting icicles in the way. The 4th is a different story, however. I find a fire keys below an unlit brazier beside a wind cannon. It's impossible to summon a brazier through the gap in the ceiling because the wind cannon will put out the fire, and trying to block the gust of wind with another echo and summoning a brazier beneath it doesn't work either, as there's simply not enough space. I'd been preparing for this challenge by testing different echoes throughout my first playthrough, and when I first encountered this puzzle, I feared I might have to discuss 2 exceptions back to back, but fortunately I have a solution beyond the nearby fire keys. That's right, it's the firework. By summoning a firework echo and moving it beside the brazier with bind before the first ignition, it's possible to light the brazier without needing a monster echo. The timing is pretty precise, but failing that, you can also summon a crate which will catch a blaze and ignite the brazier as well. So for those of you keeping track, that's the second critical use of the fire echo of 3. We're nearing the end of the dungeon now, and one final puzzle remains. A nearby switch propels a snowball towards a button, which would raise the bars blocking the big key. But we need to activate a series of fans to melt the icicles blocking the way. I make a start on the series of pedestal puzzles ahead, but the only really challenging section here is another tile puzzle. As I'm missing the ice block echo, I can't rely on pushing a block across the ice. But I managed to solve the puzzle by placing a crate on top of a bed, and having the bed disappear by summoning beyond my echo cap while timing my jump on the opposite switch. After a combat room against a white Wolfos, some incredibly tedious experiences with Freezards, and a lot of moving orbs between pedestals, I eventually roll the snowball towards the button successfully, granting me access to the boss. Unfortunately, the boss's lair is just downstairs. You know, if I had a nickel for every time I'd fought a Yeti monster at the end of a dungeon whose family member I'd befriended, I'd have 2 nickels. Or at least I would if this were actually Conde's brother. Instead, it's Scorchill. The second reason why the Freezard is a necessary exception. Scorchill wears this goofy looking helmet which alters his attacks between ice and fire. When the helmet is attuned to ice, I'm able to damage it by lifting the flame of a brazier beside it, after which it's simply a case of pulling the helmet off and damaging Scorchill with spiked rollers. The problem arises in phase 2, when Scorchill puts his helmet back on, this time attuned to fire. Once again, the only way I'm able to deal with this is with the Freezard. Even if I picked up echoes like the Ice Block or Snowball, these wouldn't have been effective against this boss nor the mini-boss. So I'm forced to use the Freezard once again to break his helmet, leaving him vulnerable once again. Thankfully, phase 3 is a little easier. Scorchill starts to alternate between fire and ice, but as I'm able to destroy the helmet with braziers when it's tuned to ice, I focus on damaging it during those openings, and avoiding damage when Scorchill attacks with fire. With that said, Scorchill's attacks cover a wide area, and the icicles it drops create obstructions in the arena, making it tricky to deal consistent damage with spike rollers. But eventually, I'm able to take him down, earning a heart container as well as the third and final sanction from the goddess Nayru, who urges us to seek out a sacred tree where both the hero and the prime energy await. We say our farewells to Conde, but before we can leave, Null appears and creates an echo of Zelda. Turns out, Null used the rifts to lure us to the sites of the goddesses, hoping that we would earn their sanctions, and plan to create an echo of Zelda to access the prime energy under disguise. Credit where it's due, it's a solid plan, and it's better than what I've come to expect from Zelda villains. But we awake at Hyrule Castle, and as soon as we're able to, we depart for the Eternal Forest. In the heart of the forest, we find General Wright, who's already been duped by Echo Zelda. To clear a path, we have to place 6 ancient orbs atop pedestals throughout the forest, making this ancient orb echo the final echo we'll learn throughout the challenge. I dash around the forest, placing orbs atop each pedestal to open the way forward, meeting with the Great Echo Tree and descending into the ancient ruins. Though Echo Zelda has found the prime energy, it splits into 3 pieces, and she escapes further into the still world. The stilled ancient ruins has fragments of every landscape we've encountered, and a number of different pathways to take, but thankfully none of these require anything outside of the ordinary platforming. I hurry to the end where Null awaits, alongside Link who's still encased in crystal. With all 3 pieces of the Triforce nearby, Echo Zelda decides that it's time to fight once and for all. And this is no easy fight. Echo Zelda floats around the arena suspended in the air, summoning echoes to fight for her. She's too high up to damage with spiked rollers mid-air, meaning we have to place down crates nearby to climb up and get within range. But this is much easier said than done, as the sheer number of enemies she creates means that placing enough crates and climbing up before any of them are destroyed is a considerable challenge. But thankfully, we have a much easier way of damaging Echo Zelda. That's right, this is the third and final time the Firework Echo is the crucial difference maker. With the Firework Echo, all we need to do is place it beneath her and ensure it stays there when the projectile is fired. This is still tricky to pull off, as Echo Zelda will float away when you draw close, and the enemies she spawns are unrelenting. But this is still much more preferable than trying to use the spiked roller. Landing enough hits will stagger Echo Zelda, causing her to drop to the ground where she's more vulnerable to attacks. But as the fight progresses, she summons more powerful monsters in greater number. After a grueling 12 minutes, I managed to defeat Echo Zelda, causing her to retreat inside Null's body. And at long last, it's time for the final use of any exception. With Link trapped in crystal above us, it's time to return the favour, by firing an arrow just as he did at the start of the game, releasing him from captivity. With this, not only have we reached the point where we don't need any more exceptions to finish the run, but we've also reached the point of no return. By proceeding here, we'll return all of Link's weapons and venture onwards to defeat Null once and for all. Interestingly enough, Link's attacks will be more powerful if you've upgraded any of his equipment, but I've kept everything at level 1 for an additional challenge. All that remains is the final battle. Inside Null's body, we have a series of fights and puzzles to navigate with Link. Fortunately, Link is a pretty capable ally, though we do have one particularly threatening enemy to fight, a Lionel. And while I'm not proud of it, I decided to employ the most effective strategy available to me. Look, he's supposed to be the hero, alright? I've done most of the work. He can start doing some of the heavy lifting at this point. I don't get to rely on Link forever though. We find ourselves split up, and I'm forced to tackle the next few puzzles and fights alone. None of these are too challenging, and even within the body of Null itself, falling into a pit is harmless, so I employ the same strategy to deal with some of the enemies here. I find Link once again in a puzzle room, with a switch atop a nearby ledge, but he struggles to climb up crates more than I would have expected. Though I suppose I have had a lot more practice at this point. Eventually we open the way forward and we're reunited in the next room, before facing off against Null, the final boss of Echoes of Wisdom. There's a lot going on in this fight. We're fighting side by side with Link, and while regular attacks against Null's body do deal some damage, we'll want to focus on pulling its arms far enough to expose a weak point, which Link can exploit with a spin attack. Severing all of Null's arms staggers it, allowing us to deal much more considerable damage, although I do find myself wrestling Link for space a little bit, as he's keen to stick close. I use the same strategy for the arms in the walls before Null emerges once more, and I repeat this pattern a few times until Null's core becomes more and more exposed. Eventually, Null retreats into a portal, but as we go to follow, we're separated from Link. Phase 2 takes us into an underwater passageway, where Null is consuming tries to recover its strength. Null will spawn an echo of Vocavore, the boss of Jabul Ruins, to try and keep us away, but the spiked roller proves just as essential as it was in our last underwater boss fight. I land enough hits to shift Null into Phase 3, returning to the previous arena and reuniting with Link. Now the fight can truly begin, and Null isn't holding anything back anymore. It has 5 arms we need to sever this time, and Null will periodically vanish, summoning echoes of previous bosses we fought in our adventure. First, Null alternates between the Seismic Talus and Mogriff, both of whom have attacks which are pretty easy to avoid. Link severs the last of Null's arms, and we deal enough damage to force it to retreat. Null attacks with arms from the walls again, but this time it summons echoes of monsters as well. Not only that, Null will summon a hand to try and grab Zelda, which can be incredibly punishing if I'm caught by it. With so much going on in this phase, it can be tricky to find an opening long enough to stretch the hand and wait for Link to land a spin attack, but eventually I'm able to do so with all 3 arms. I focus on severing Null's arms from its body once more, but now Null will summon Ganon and Scorchill periodically, who are definitely a much more threatening combination of bosses. Null collapses for a second time and retreats once more after taking enough damage from Link and I. And one thing to note about being seized by Null's hand in this phase is that you actually need to deal damage to it to be released, which can be difficult with only a spiked roller. Not only that, we're still vulnerable to all of the nearby monsters, but thankfully I'm able to free myself. Null eventually reappears, and I focus on pulling its arms once more. Null has started combining boss echoes for its attacks, but I'm able to stretch out its final arm for Link to sever with a spin attack. With Null vulnerable once more, we deal enough damage to expose its piece of the Triforce, which I bind and pull from the monster's core alongside Link. With this, the battle is over. Null has been defeated, the threat of the rifts is no more, and the challenge is completed. I'm happy to say that no, you cannot beat Echoes of Wisdom with only furniture. But despite that, I think this is just about as close as you can get. I managed to complete the game with only 4 exceptions: the Whole Mill, Bombfish, Buzzblob, and Freezard. But I suspect that others will find strategies and sequence breaks that may reduce this number in the future. Nevertheless, I had a lot of fun with this challenge. As someone who grew up with classic Zelda games like Link to the Past, Minish Cap, and Wind Waker, Echoes of Wisdom delivered on almost everything I was missing from more recent Zelda games. And while it's hard to not get just a little teary-eyed during the final scene with Tri, I'm hopeful that this isn't goodbye to the classic Zelda experience we know and love, but rather it's a see you later. Thanks for watching. Creating videos like these that require playing through an entire game with a unique challenge is no easy feat, but I aim to make these videos as entertaining as possible. And I'd love to know if you have any other ideas for me to tackle. Playing through Echoes of Wisdom for this challenge brought to mind all sorts of other challenges I could attempt, such as what's the fewest number of echoes you need to learn to beat the game? Or if you're a fan of other Nintendo titles, check out some of my other videos. And finally, if you like the sound of my voice or want to stay tuned for whatever challenge videos I've got planned next, don't forget to subscribe. My channel is still pretty small in the grand scheme of things, but that just means that every single show of support is so much more significant. Anyway, that's all from me. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Until then, just remember that if you're ever lost and don't know what to do, there are few problems that can't be solved without a staircase of beds or a spiked roller.